Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Today, folks, our guest is William Shewfelt. He's an actor currently starring as Brody, the Red Power Ranger in Nickelodeon's Power Rangers Ninja Steel. He's incredibly smart and well-read, an overall Renaissance man studying economics, winning essay competitions and spelling bees, and also powerlifting and bodybuilding. William is basically a real-life superhero. I'm super excited to have him on, and not just on TV. And Will has been practicing a carnivore diet for over a year. He also has a very practical and useful carnivore shredding program. It's thecarnivoreshreddingprogram.com that everyone listening should go check out. I purchased it myself, and it's really high quality information. Thank you for joining me, William, and welcome to the Carnivore Cast.
Wow, Scott, thank you so much, man. Everything I say after that introduction will just be a letdown because that was stellar. Thank you so much. No, it's an honor to be on here, and I'm really glad that this carnivore movement is taking off. More so than just the title of carnivore, the fact that people are learning about whole food nutrition, low carb nutrition, prioritizing foods that we are ancestrally designed to eat, it's so important. It's going to take care of so many preventable leading causes of disease and death. So I think, honestly, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and hopefully this continues to pick up steam. You know, a lot of people are attaching terms like a fad diet to what's going on here. But really, if the science backs it and the clinical results back it, I don't know how that's a fad. You know, there's just a bunch of stellar research going on out there, and there are a lot of results from so many different people. So I think we're onto something really interesting here, and I'm excited to get into the weeds with you.
Awesome. Thank you, William. Some great points you make there, and would just love to start with what brought you to carnivore and take us through your health journey a bit. I know you've gone through various diets. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I know a lot of people got onto the carnivore diet by listening to the high priest of the carnivore diet, Dr. Shawn Baker. But I remember when Shawn, it was about his first or second month doing carnivore, and I was just starting to research it through Zero Carb Zen, Principia Carnivora, a bunch of these kind of different groups that you'll find online, different websites. And I was starting to learn more about it, and it was like Shawn Baker and Ted Naiman and Dr. Georgia Ede and a few of the other folks that are really into it. I was following them on Twitter. I do a lot of Twitter stalking. I don't post anything on there, but I stalk quite a few people on there. And I was following the results that they were getting, and it really started to pique my interest. So that was kind of the beginning of it when I learned about it. But let me just take it back a couple of years. So I grew up with a pretty carb-heavy diet, a relatively healthy carb-heavy diet, I would say. We weren't eating too many processed foods as kids, but it was, you know, a lot of white rice and just kind of West Indian foods. So we ate a ton of that stuff. You know, we were all skinny. We were super athletic. No problems there. I go off to college, and I pretty much start eating whatever I want. You know, you're eating on a budget, and everybody else is eating Pop-Tarts and pizza and quesadillas. So that's pretty much what I did. And I was eating a bunch of junk. And for the first time in my life, my health just started to really tank. I had no energy. It didn't matter how much I slept. I woke up tired. I had so much trouble focusing, which, you know, that's critical in college. You need your focus. And I was pretty much fueled by just caffeine and then constant sugar fixes. I always needed some sort of sugar fix. And the other thing, that the last thing you want in college is to have terrible skin. You know, that's not really going to help your chances as much. So I just had the worst acne of any human being I had ever seen. And people think that's being dramatic or exaggerating, but I mean, seriously, every inch of my face was covered in highly severe acne. So those were all sufficient motivating factors for me to realize, look, I need to look into my diet here. Just something intuitively told me this has to do with diet. I'm not doing something right here. I need to change this. So naturally, I thought the healthiest thing to do is to go vegan. And I didn't do lazy vegan. I wasn't eating Oreos and drinking beer and eating French fries, all of which are vegan. I was doing this thing like by the book. I was doing it whole grains, whole foods, lots of organic fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, all the superfoods, the matcha, goji berries, hibiscus tea, everything I could get my hands on. So I followed this thing religiously, never once cheated on a vegan diet for 4 years. It sounds like I'm talking about a girl here. So I never once cheated on this vegan diet for 4 years. And my health just started to steadily decline. And this is an interesting thing you'll see with a lot of vegans. You'll feel better at the beginning. I had a lot of great things, lost some weight, skin cleared up, just thought it was amazing. But over time, the underlying micronutrient deficiencies, when you're lacking in some of the B vitamins and iron and B12, it doesn't matter how good you're supplementing with this stuff, those deficiencies will start to surface and you'll start to see the results. Now, I was finally in New Zealand doing the Power Rangers show, and I was one season into it, and we just had a hellish work schedule, and the vegan diet just couldn't support me anymore. I wasn't able to be eating all the time like I needed to have my meals on standby because we were just filming nonstop. You're busy, you got things to do, you're getting pulled in a bunch of different directions. You don't really have any downtime. So it was just like full on, and my health was getting worse and worse and worse. And I was starting to get more into binge eating, and I couldn't maintain a lean and sort of chiseled, ripped athletic physique. And I just kind of realized, okay, something needs to change. So first season ends, and we have a 3-week break. And during that 3-week break, I go back to the States, and I just threw myself into researching this. I was like, I got to change something. I don't know what it is, but I have to change this. So what I pretty much stumbled upon was cutting out carbs and getting rid of the idea of calorie counting and just eating a lot more intuitively. So I started messing around with that. And what I was doing was one meal a day, and it was pretty much meat, eggs, and veggies, and a tiny amount of fruit, maybe about 50 grams of carbs of fruit, one meal a day. And I started dropping weight like crazy, and I just got really, really lean. And this was in like 1 week. Like the abs were popping in about 1 week, and I was like, okay, I'm really onto something here. And that was pretty much my introduction to the keto diet. And ever since then, that was in January of 2017. So since then, I've experimented with it a lot. And a little over a year ago now, I started doing a carnivorous diet. And that's really what's been, it's kicked the results, so much further ahead. And now what I do is kind of a variation of that. It's not strictly carnivorous. I will occasionally include some low sugar fruit. I don't do any fibrous veggies. I'm not really into leafy greens or cruciferous veggies. I'll do a tiny amount of some low sugar fruit. So occasionally I'll do like an avocado, or I might even do berries. But it's basically I'm eating nothing but red meat, fish, a ton of eggs, and some dairy. And that's pretty much what my diet looks like now.
Awesome. That's an amazing story, William. And I think a lot of the listeners will resonate with it, and just struggling and fighting up a hill, feeling like you're doing everything right. Playing it by the book with a vegan diet or a low fat diet and just running into problems. One of the things you touched on, a couple things you touched on that I want to dive into. The first, and I've heard you speak about this before, is some of the mental aspects of diet. So you mentioned that on sort of more of a standard American diet with quesadillas and college food, you were feeling tired a lot. Can you talk about some of the other mental aspects of diet? How a lot of people think, food is just fuel. It doesn't matter what it is. My brain is going to work on its own. It's independent of my body. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay between diet and mental fortitude and emotional fortitude?
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole sort of frame of mind of, your mind and your emotional state and your well-being and your brain are pretty much, these are genetically inherited traits, and they're not necessarily influenced by your diet very much, is very outdated. And I think hopefully that's starting to phase out, and there's, a paradigm shift, and we're able to see, okay, diet, you might have, the gun might be loaded from your genetics, but what's pulling the trigger is your diet. So you can honestly resolve so many of these issues, so many preventable things with diet. I think some great people to point to right off the bat. Dr. Georgia Ede does a lot of great writing and posts for Psychology Today about the effects of food on your mood, on your emotional well-being. And she particularly advocates a very carnivorous diet. Michaela Peterson, Jordan Peterson, they both use a carnivorous diet for, mental well-being, for treating anxiety, depression, things like that. So it absolutely has an effect on your mood. And if you just think about what are the things that influence our focus, our mood, all of these different things. So you think about, okay, so we have all of these neurotransmitters that are firing. We have different levels of hormones, and you have your dopamine and you have your serotonin, and you have all of these things. These are all being created from the foods that you're eating, and that's influencing gene expression and how your body is functioning. How could that not be related to your diet? It's entirely related to diet, So I experienced very strongly, I feel really bad depending on what I'm eating. If I'm eating a pretty bad diet, or if I throw in too many carbs, too many cheat days and processed foods and stuff like that, it absolutely affects my mental health. And I noticed that I start to deal with things like anxiety. So it's very, very important for me, just from an emotional point of view, to stay on top of my diet. And I try to be very, very careful with that. So that's a huge part of it. But also in terms of focus, I think a lot of people are familiar with the brain benefits of a ketogenic diet. Now, that absolutely extends to a carnivorous diet. A carnivorous diet is ketogenic. You will be in perhaps a lower level of ketosis. You might not have your millimolars up to 4, 5. Some of the higher reads you'll get from drinking MCT oil and drinking a bunch of butter, and maybe supplementing with exogenous ketones. You might not get the highest readings, but you will be in ketosis, because ketosis is dependent upon your liver glycogen. And if that liver glycogen is empty, then you're going to be in ketosis. And if you're not consuming exogenous glucose, then you're absolutely going to be in ketosis. So it just might be a lower level. And, people get worried about gluconeogenesis. And for some people, that is a concern. If you're doing this for certain therapeutic reasons, you might want to be careful with the gluconeogenesis. But generally, for the average person that's just doing this for health, I don't think that's really something to be worried about. When we're talking about focus, it's huge when you're fueling that brain with those ketones. And you really get that nice zoned in, laser focused feeling. And it's not influenced by the whole blood sugar roller coaster, Everybody knows that feeling when you're trying to work on something and then you need your next craving, you need some almonds next to you, or you need something to eat. You really don't have to deal with that when you're doing this sort of diet, which is huge. Like, if you're like me and you like to sit down and just work on something and to not get distracted and to really get into that flow state, it's so beneficial to not have to eat all the time. I really enjoy that. And I also have to give a huge plug to the greatest brain supplement of all time, coffee, which I'm drinking right now. That's not necessarily an animal product, but I do love my coffee.
Good for you. Yeah, that's a great explanation, William. I really appreciate you mentioning so many aspects about the mental side. Georgia Ede is a fantastic resource. I would recommend folks go check out diagnosisdiet.com. And another aspect of that she talks about, and that has been documented in research, is essentially when you're having carbs, refined carbs, sugars, these foods that spike dopamine, it's like a drug. And if you keep hitting that signal over and over again, you can desensitize yourself to it, to the point where you're living in a state where nothing really stimulates your happiness signal and your arousal signal. So I'm not saying sugar is cocaine or heroin or whatever, but there are many aspects of food addiction that are similar to drug addiction and can have similar effects on the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
And William, you talked about the vegan diet and you talked about the lack of B vitamins. I'm curious, do you think it was all about what you were leaving out that made the vegan diet not work for you? Or do you think it may have also been what you may have had too much of?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's absolutely, this is kind of a lazy answer, but it's absolutely a combination of the two. So what I was putting into my body were definitely foods that are suboptimal for, just having a good, human performance. So if we're talking about tons of beans all the time, beans are not very well digested. I don't care how long you give your microbiome and your gut bacteria to figure out how to ferment them, you're still going to be bloated and gassy all the time, and you're never going to feel quite good. I gave myself 4 years, and I would still, whenever I ate beans, constantly gassy, bloated, did not feel great at all. So that's one of them. And then if we're talking about, gluten-containing foods, lots of grains, whole grains, and the sort of fiber that comes with that, those are, relatively recent foods as far as human evolution goes. All of these sort of mass-produced plant foods come post-agricultural revolution. And yes, we developed certain adaptations to be able to handle them. But for one, the variations that we were eating back then were probably more fibrous and had less carbohydrate. And there were also different processes that were used to make them more digestible, such as fermentation, soaking, sprouting, things like that. So the way we eat these things nowadays, for one, they're not optimal foods. And two, we're not even eating these suboptimal foods optimally. So it's really just a toss-up there. I was also eating huge quantities of fiber every day. So I'm talking about probably over 100 grams of fiber per day, which is like, if people know how much fiber is in vegetables, I was eating an astonishing amount of fiber. And mainly how I achieved that was through massive green smoothies I would make. I mean, I would make probably about a gallon's worth of these really, really fibrous green smoothies, just thinking they were the ultimate superfood. And yeah, so I think a lot of the things I was putting in were absolutely disrupting my digestion, my microbiome, my gut bacteria, just my overall stomach health. Now, when you bring up what I was leaving out, that's another huge part of the puzzle. So B vitamins, absolutely. Iron, I wasn't really consuming any, I believe it's heme iron. Only consuming plant-based sources of iron, which I believe are non-heme iron. I might have that wrong or backwards. So my iron wasn't in its most bioavailable form. All the B vitamins, I was only getting those through plant foods, which you're not going to get in sufficient quantities as you would through animal foods, especially red meat. And yeah, so just I'm trying to think about other foods that you generally find in animals that are more bioavailable. Also, if we're talking about fat-soluble nutrients, there are a lot of fat-soluble nutrients that you get from animal foods that I wasn't getting in that vegan diet. So there were a lot of things missing, and what I was putting into it wasn't helping me either. So definitely a combination of the two.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And that's a ton of fiber. 100 grams of fiber is no small feat. And can you talk a little bit about anti-nutrients, salicylates, phytates, oxalates, some of those chemicals, chemical warfare, I believe Georgia Ede talks about in vegetables?
Yeah, absolutely. So the famous Little Shop of Horrors. So when we're talking about anti-nutrients, we have to remember that I think some people react more strongly to these than other people. And some people react very strongly to these. Simply consuming certain spices or certain histamine-containing foods, even aged meats and cheeses and things like that, people could react very, very strongly. Salicylates and oxalates and all of the other things that you mentioned, which are obviously generally found in plant foods. So it's really great when you start this carnivorous diet to start it as minimally as possible. I mean, really just take it down to red meat. If you could just take it down to red meat, and some people go as far as doing it raw. I wouldn't say you really have to do it raw. I mean, I guess it depends on who you are, but honestly, if you just take it down to some cooked red meat, you don't even have to make it grass-fed. Just cooked red meat and see how your body's responding to that. And then if you could slowly venture out from there to including some eggs now, and then from that, maybe to trying to include some pork, maybe some dairy, and slowly expanding your borders to see, okay, what can my body tolerate and what can't it tolerate? Eventually, I think, humans are honestly omnivores. Humans, we're always able to survive and adapt according to our environments, but we are omnivores. So I think if you can include certain low carbohydrate plant foods, that's probably a good thing, just so you're not risking any sort of mineral or micronutrient deficiencies. So I like to tell people to sort of experiment a little bit with low sugar fruit and maybe some leafy greens. But honestly, those things are optional. They're not necessary. They're absolutely optional, and you can experience fantastic health without them. So for me, pretty much what I found is I get away very well with a lot of different animal foods. So I can pretty much do dairy, bacon. I'll do red meat, tons of eggs every day. I mean, I'm eating probably about a dozen eggs a day, probably about 2 pounds of red meat. And then I'll throw in some other things on top of that. And the only plant foods I really do at this point would be maybe half an avocado once or twice a week. And then occasionally, if I feel I want it or maybe I need it, I'll do a small amount of blackberries, maybe like a cup of blackberries. And that's pretty much the extent of it. I mean, if we're going to count in things like spices, yes, I do use some spices. And I also drink coffee. But generally, I mean, in terms of actual foodstuffs, I keep it pretty minimal.
Got it. That's great. I was going to ask to get a bit into the details of your personal day-to-day diet. But it sounds like you go beyond the simple, orc Lord of the Rings, why can't we have some meats style carnivore diet?
Yeah. That's a great quote. That'd be so funny if somebody put Sean Baker's face on that.
That'd be a great meme.
Yeah, in terms of that, I mean, I think that's a fantastic starting point. And what Sean Baker has done is, honestly, he's put himself out on a limb, because from doing his podcast, I realized that he's actually extremely open-minded, and he realizes, okay, there are different things that work for different people. He's just really tried to push the fact that, look, meat is honestly a healthy food, especially red meat. And it's something that most Americans should be consuming more of, and far less of the processed garbage that's out there. So that's fantastic. But I think when you move beyond that and you're looking into optimizing performance, mental health, your overall health, and what works best for you, that's when you want to start looking at, should I incorporate some organ meats? Should I be looking into a little bit more grass-fed? Should I be optimizing my omega-3 to omega-6 ratios? Making sure you got your electrolytes in check. And then you could start looking at, can I also start doing maybe a small amount of low-carb plant foods and see how I could really make this work for myself? So that's what I encourage everybody to do. And this has to be done through self-experimentation. It doesn't matter what you read on a Facebook group or what your favorite guru is saying online or on Instagram or on YouTube. Like, the amount of people that are providing advice and information out there, there are so many people. At the end of the day, even I provide a program and I give advice to people. But the thing is, at the end of the day, you have to self-experiment. And if something's not working for you, then be honest with yourself. It doesn't matter if you want to cling to the idea. Be honest with yourself and say, okay, I'm not getting the results I want. I need to change something. So that's really important. For me, I eat mainly for energy, for mood, and definitely for body composition.
Yeah, I love that. It's great to start with the simple, focusing on meat. And I think Sean's message about just trying to get more people to eat more animal protein is so great. And starting with beef, as you said, and treating it like an elimination diet of slowly adding things back, I think that's excellent. But also, your point around self-experimentation is so crucial. I personally have been on a carnivore diet for almost 2 years and have had organ meats off and on. I've done the US Wellness Meats liverwurst, cooked liver a few times, but actually got, and I know Sean Baker isn't a huge fan of blood tests, and we can go down that rabbit hole, but I'll save that for later. I actually got my folate and vitamin A tested. And my vitamin A was on the low end of normal. My folate was very, very low. So I made a point to go out and say, hey, how can I incorporate organ meats more regularly? And I also took a tip from you Will, and started taking beef liver capsules. Found a very high quality brand that I trust on Amazon. And I think it's just important to always keep an eye on things and keep testing stuff for yourself. Some people find when they reintroduce eggs, they have sensitivities to that. Some people have sensitivities to dairy. Sometimes your fat is too high and you feel sick, or you're not losing weight at the rate you expected after a long time. Sometimes your protein is too high and you're just dragging all day long. So it's really important to just slowly tweak things, tweak one variable at a time, but really just getting back to basics. The most important thing is eat meat.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so that really interests me that you brought that up about the blood tests, folate levels, vitamin A levels. I'm really interested to know, so before you got that blood test, what led to you getting the blood test, and how were you feeling given that your folate and vitamin A levels were lower? I'm interested to see if you think that is that's necessarily a bad thing, or is that more representative of, how they get these general ranges from people that eat carbohydrates and then they apply it to you, who doesn't eat carbohydrates. So might that be a feature of just being on a carnivore diet? And how do you feel now that you're incorporating more liver and organ meats? Do you notice any subjective feelings of well-being? And also, have your blood numbers changed, or have you done that yet?
Great questions. So I'm going to pull a Shawn Baker here and say that I had no clinical symptoms of nutrient deficiency. If you look up low folate or folate deficiency, the symptoms are extreme fatigue. So I would basically feel tired all the time, feel like I need naps. That is not the case at all. I am wide awake at 5 o'clock in the morning, springing out of bed, have consistent energy all day long. My workouts are great. So no evidence of folate deficiency or other deficiencies. What motivated me to get the blood test is I just get regular blood work done. My doctor is a huge fan of blood work, and so I get different panels, lipid panel, et cetera, every 3 to 6 months. And so I just said, hey, can we throw this one in? Can we throw in folate? Can we throw in vitamin A? I've done TSH. I've done basically every blood test you could possibly want to know. I haven't retested it since that last test. I believe that last test was in June, I want to say, or maybe May. And my folate was low, but again, no symptoms, haven't experienced any tangible improvements. I'm not all of a sudden bursting with extra energy as a result of supplementing with more liver. But we'll see.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So liver supplementation, that's kind of one of those things I do in a strange way because I feel like I should. And I don't necessarily I can't really tell how I feel, differently. But that's an interesting thing. Like occasionally I will get symptoms of being really, really tired and like in a slump. But honestly, like I put my body through a lot. Like I sleep terribly. I'll just be honest. And it's not like my sleep quality is poor, but I actually just don't give myself many hours because I like to get up early and do a lot of things throughout the day. So I'm kind of purposely sleep depriving myself, which isn't smart. Don't recommend it to anybody. But occasionally I will get some, basically some sleep debt that adds up. And that's when I start to experiment with more, let's get more liver going, maybe do some avocado, maybe do some magnesium supplementation. So it's usually as a reaction to that sort of thing. But honestly, I think if you're sleeping well and you feel great, it'd be interesting to see what the effects are.
Yeah. I'll certainly let you know if there's a tangible increase in my next blood value, but I can definitely see what you're saying. You're a very busy guy. Conquering the world isn't easy. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a bit of sleep to do that, I guess. But I would love to just expand on that a little bit, Will, in you're talking about all the things you're doing. Do you find carnivore to be restrictive socially or hard when you're traveling, when you're on set, on the road? How do you make it work when you can't cook your own meals?
No, I don't really find it to be restrictive socially. So for one thing, I restrict myself socially. So I don't really hang out with a whole lot of people, to be honest. Especially like the whole young Hollywood crowd and stuff like that. It's just not my scene. So most of the time, I mean, I'm just spending time with people that I'm working with or collaborating with, shooting with, my girlfriend, stuff like that. So I don't have too much of an issue with it socially. Pretty much meat seems to be a staple of any sort of social function you go to, though. So usually I'm able to find some sort of protein option wherever I go. It's never that much of an issue. And outside of that, I've found a ton of different places that I do and get quality sources of animal protein. So when I'm on the road, I'm pretty much always stopping in at maybe Sprouts, or maybe I'll go to Whole Foods, or maybe I'll go to Ralph's. And the kind of things I would get would usually be like, I'll get some hard-boiled eggs. I might get some roasted chicken. I might do, if I'm at Whole Foods, for example, I might even do like some cottage cheese, things like that. Maybe even like salami. So these aren't necessarily this isn't necessarily grass-fed beef, but for me, it's still animal protein, and I'm still able to sort of stick to that. So I don't really find it to be that restrictive. And I'm also not super religious about it. So occasionally, maybe every 1 or 2 weeks, I'll eat something that's definitely not carnivore. Maybe me and my girlfriend will go out for pizza or ice cream or something like that. And usually it's just a process of the next day I'll fast a little bit more. I'll do a nice hard workout, and then I'm back into ketosis and I keep doing my thing. So again, that's not something I recommend either. That's just something I found that I can get away with. But yeah, no, I don't find it to be too much of an issue. It was funny. Sean Baker actually was asking me like, what's the backlash in terms of like Hollywood, and how are they dealing with it? Because it's usually like a heavily vegan community. And actually, I did a podcast with Simland from YouTube. He does a lot of biohacking videos, and guys, I can tell that Will's like carefully walking on eggshells, because if he says something bad about vegans, like he might not be getting roles in the future. And I remember thinking like, no, that's not really the case at all. It's just nobody seems to care what I eat. Like low carb is actually pretty popular in Hollywood. A lot of actors do low carb. A lot of actors eat, meat and have tons of protein. So it's not like this, this is like a whole vegan Scientology community where, everybody has to fall in line. So it doesn't seem to be much of an issue for me. I haven't gotten any backlash so far.
That's awesome. You heard it here, folks. If you want to be ripped like a movie star, eat carnivore. But no, that's great that you can fit it into your lifestyle. I think people really like hearing about the lifestyle aspects. And I know you've mentioned before that you practice intermittent fasting. And one thing that I struggle with sometimes, I found ways to make it work, but I know other folks do too, is going to a restaurant with friends. Maybe you haven't had a chance to eat all day, and the protein portions are minuscule at some restaurants. Do you intentionally just kind of plan around that? Say, hey, I was planning on having 2 meals today, or I was planning on having 1 meal today. I'm going to go to the grocery store, grab some hard-boiled eggs, fill up, make sure I'm not starving myself before I go to dinner. How do you sort of deal with that type of situation?
Yeah. So honestly, I find, if we have to prioritize fasting or eating this carnivorous, low carb, high protein diet, I always prioritize sticking to the diet instead of fasting. So I would rather, eat before the dinner and maybe have like some eggs or something like that, or have something to sort of satiate myself, knowing that there's going to be a tiny piece of chicken breast or some little piece of fish or a tiny little piece of pretty much no fat on it steak. So if I know that that's the case and it's going to be something tiny like that, or I might do like a low carb burger where there's no bun, then I definitely would eat beforehand and make sure that I'm not super hungry. I've put myself in that position before where, a restaurant all day and then the food comes out and there's like some fries that come with it, or there's something delicious on the side. And I'm like, to hell with it. I'm just going to eat it. Honestly, nowadays, I think it's so much more important to just stick to the diet and forget fasting if you're in that sort of situation. If you have more control over your food options, and you know that you're going to be able to last and you're going to go home after work and you're going to have your food there, then go for it. Honestly, yeah, knock yourself out. But I'm definitely prioritizing now, not so much fasting. And the other reason that I'm going a little bit easier on the fasting nowadays is that depending on your workout intensity and how lean you are, you don't want to push it too hard with fasting because you can really start to mess with your cortisol. And then that'll make it a lot harder for you to stay lean. So for me, like I'm doing usually about an hour of sort of zone 2 cardio in the mornings. That's usually at like 4:30 or 5 in the morning. And then later at night, I'll be doing kickboxing or like plyometrics, fight training, might be lifting weights, doing sprints, different things like that. So I'm training pretty hard every day, maybe about 2 hours of training per day. Fasting is not for me at this point. Like I don't want to be fasting too much in that sort of state because it can really just send my body into a real stressed out mode.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. And I think some of the fasting fads or fasting hype, fasting popularity has gotten out of control. And I think Ted Naiman has an excellent graphic from a study that showed essentially the difference between a zero carb diet and fasting for control of blood glucose, I believe it was, and they were almost identical.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with what you're saying. It's better to stick to the diet. Don't worry about your fasting window. I even used to practice more of a lean gain style, fast till 12 or 1 and then eat a big lunch, eat dinner at 7 or 8. And I found, I'm relatively lean. I'm certainly not doing as much exercise as you are, but I lift weights. And I was getting cold in the morning. I was getting jittery. And I think that's just a sign of, like you said, cortisol spiking, and it can be very unhealthy. So I actually make a point now to have a large meal in the morning to sort of to set my circadian rhythms, get the day started. And I also eat a little more frequently, because I am trying to put on more lean mass, trying to regenerate, some bone tissue and some muscle tissue.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. Fasting is absolutely beneficial depending on who you are. If we're talking about like autophagy and so many different processes, it's a fantastic way to get into a deep state of ketosis. But like with anything else, you can really, really go too hard with it. And too much of a good thing is just that. So I definitely preach moderation with that now. Like not everybody should be doing one meal a day. Not everybody should be doing a 4-hour eating window or an 8-hour eating window. You ultimately have to adjust it according to your lifestyle, according to, the demands you place on yourself and what's going on throughout your day and your goals. It's so easy to find a guru or someone you look up to and to just copy and paste what they do from their life onto yours. And it's completely different circumstances. And, and then when it doesn't work out for you, then you start to think, maybe I just don't have the willpower, or maybe I'm just lazy. And how can they do that? How come I can't do this? But it's a different situation. For me, honestly, what I'm doing right now is I love Ted Naiman's stuff. Huge fan of him. So my protein target now, because of the amount of training I'm doing, and because I do want to have some of that gluconeogenesis to make sure that my muscle glycogen is full, I'm eating about 200 grams of protein a day, and that's pretty much the only goal I have for myself. So 200 grams of protein a day. It doesn't matter how many meals it takes. So if I can eat that in one meal, fantastic. If I eat that in 3 or 4 meals, that's fine too. I prefer to do about 2 meals though. 2 meals usually feels just about right for me. So that's my goal. And then I will scale my carbs plus fats depending on how I'm feeling. So if I'm super depleted, super tired, trained extremely hard, and I feel like I need some more fuel, I will always go for more fat. But occasionally I'll even throw in a bit of those low sugar fruits in there. So I might do some avocados or some berries, even dark chocolate every now and then. I'll do like some 90% dark chocolate, keep the carbs pretty low. So I'll do stuff like that. But generally what I'm really upping would be more eggs, some cod liver oil, maybe a little bit of heavy cream in the coffee, might be doing some more bacon, stuff like that. So I always prefer to do a bit more dietary fat. I tend to feel much better on that. But yeah, just sometimes my body tells me, have a little bit of carbs, have a little bit of, that low sugar fruit, and I feel better for it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent approach. And what you said really resonates around people finding gurus and trying to copy and paste a model or a program or a template. And I think it's great to start with something like that, and it can make things really clear for you, but you really have to learn to think for yourself, challenge your beliefs, and like we were talking about before, just self-experiment, see how you feel, really try to be as objective about it and subjective about it as possible, in assessing how things work for you. William, I'm curious, where do you get your information? You're so well read. You seem to know so much. We've mentioned a lot of the experts here, but I'm curious just how you come up to speed on all these various topics.
Oh, wow. Man, a variety of different sources. My thing is I'll usually just start to go down rabbit holes, whether it's through books, articles, studies that come out. I follow a bunch of different people on Twitter, on Instagram. I listen to a lot of different podcasts. I love reading up on different blogs. Georgia Ede, we were talking about, she has a fantastic one. Amy Berger has a fantastic one. Peter Attia. There are so many different people. I could name so many podcasts that I love as well. But pretty much, if I just find something that interests me, honestly, I love to do zone 2 cardio in the gym, usually in the morning, and that's about an hour for me. So I usually take that hour, and as I'm on the Stairmaster or as I'm, walking on the treadmill incline or whatever, I'll honestly listen to a bunch of podcasts, or I will read articles, and I'll try to catch up on the things that I want to learn about. Also, in terms of like LA traffic and all that kind of stuff, I spend a lot of time in my car. So that's usually when I also catch up on podcasts and audiobooks and things like that. It's really, really important to prioritize self-education the same way we prioritize our health and then our fitness and things like our sleep and career. We also need to constantly be educating ourselves. I forget exactly what philosopher said it, but it was the idea of the only good is knowledge and the only evil is ignorance. And I agree with that. I don't think that you serve to benefit by, willfully remaining ignorant about anything. So I think that, it's really good to educate yourself as much as you can. I love the quote by Jim Rohn where he talks about a formal education will make you a living, but self-education will make you a fortune. So I definitely encourage people, when you find something you're passionate about, educate yourself on it, learn as much as you can. You don't have to sit down with a book. You don't have to, sign up for a course online. You can listen to podcasts, you can read blogs, you can watch YouTube videos, however you want to educate yourself, but just make sure that you're taking in information. And then I would also encourage people outside of that, when you learn about things, take some time to experiment with it and don't keep flooding your mind with information, because sometimes you can definitely get information overload. And just as you're finally starting to find your stride and you're finding something that works for you, and then you hear something from another guru or a scientist or doctor, and they say to do something completely different, and you're like, oh, well, there goes that. Let me completely change my whole protocol. So give yourself some time. I see that a lot of people, especially in this whole ketogenic low-carb community, are perhaps consuming too much information sometimes, and they're trying to do too many things at once. So give yourself time. This is a lifelong journey. You don't have to figure it out this week. Health and fitness and wellness and weight loss, these are things that we get our whole lives to experiment with and find out what works for us. So take your time with it. I would definitely encourage people.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And I like how you brought in not only the importance of self-education, listening to podcasts, reading books, always have a learner's mindset, but also the other side of it, which is paralysis by analysis. I think a lot of folks can get caught up in just too much asking questions about the minutia, listening to the same questions asked over and over and over again without trying things out for themselves. So I think there really is value in that. William, you talked about on another podcast, a lot of the folks listening to this will be people who've been practicing a carnivore diet for some time, but we talked before about how to start a carnivore diet. I'm curious if you can talk about how you'd introduce a carnivore diet to friends or people who want to learn more. And then I think you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this, but how does your girlfriend's approach differ from yours in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would honestly encourage people that want to start a carnivore diet. I don't exactly like to do the complete elimination approach at the beginning, because some people find it to be so radical and so restrictive that they just can't stick to it. So I like to encourage people, honestly, just cut out the sugars and the grains and all the processed foods from your diet, and let's keep it down to real whole foods. And honestly, let's just take it down to meat, eggs, maybe a little bit of fruit and some vegetables. And then from there, I like to take people on to, okay, now let's eliminate some of the veggies and some of the fruits, and let's keep it down to a really, really low carb approach. And that'll help them incrementally get into that keto adaptation stage. All the while, you're supplementing with your electrolytes and making sure you're taking care of all your bases there. So yeah, for myself, I love to throw myself into things. Like I would definitely go for a radical approach. Like when I went from vegan to keto, it was literally overnight. I didn't do any sort of incremental approach. I like to throw myself into it. But I found that when I'm introducing this to friends, to family, to people that I know, it just doesn't seem to work for them. It's too radical. It's too many, huge life changes at once, and they're not able to sustain it. So I think an incremental approach tends to work better for them. So that's what I would say about that, usually because I have limited time with them as well. Now, in my program, in the Carnivore Shredding program, and I also have some new content coming out soon. So I'll kind of give a spoiler about that, but I do have some new content coming out soon that appeals to different body types and people wanting to, a women's program and a men's program that's more focused around bulking, a men's program that's more focused around dropping fat. So in those, I'm going to be more like clear out your fridge and let's start this thing, fresh starting tomorrow. So it's going to be a bit more of a 180. And in terms of what my girlfriend does, so she's not as strict about it as I am. But the crazy thing is, man, she looks good no matter what she eats. So she usually does mostly a low carb approach. So she'll do sort of low carb ketogenic approach, a bit more higher fat. And she's very insulin sensitive. Her body does fantastic on higher carbs. So she will eat some carbs occasionally. Usually they're pretty healthy carbs, but that's sort of how we approach it. I definitely do much lower carb, and I'll drop back fats a little bit because I'm trying to go for a much leaner, sort of chiseled physique. And honestly, me and her, every now and then we'll just get the urge to go out and eat some good old standard American junk, and we absolutely do it, and we have very little guilt afterwards. And it doesn't usually take us too long to get back into ketosis the next day. But again, that's one of those things like, look, we're both in our early 20s. We both work out. We're both pretty lean. And 95% of the time we're doing everything right. So that 5% of the time that we will eat stuff like that, it doesn't tend to affect us very much. Now, for the person that is perhaps older or has a lot of weight to lose or is dealing with something like type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, has a condition that is contingent upon remaining in ketosis. So let's say you're dealing with cancer, you're dealing with epilepsy, you're dealing with anything like that. I would not recommend messing around with this stuff. Like, take it seriously, stay in ketosis. Don't go doing cheat days for no reason.
Right. That's great. I really like that. And my fiance and I are the same way. She is more low carb ketogenic, and I tease her all the time for the plants she's cooking. But yeah, we're both, I'm carnivore. She's a little bit more lenient with it, but we both eat, I would say, healthier than 99% of the people, especially our age out there. And I'm very excited for that new content coming out, William. I'll definitely have to check that out. And, folks on the podcast listening should as well. And I would love, just because you've seen both worlds, one thing I want to spend more time on this podcast is the carnivore movement and growing it. And I know you had a chance to speak about carnivore at KetoCon. You're becoming a voice in this community. how can we grow the carnivore movement in a more positive way than other dietary dogmas that sometimes isolate or alienate people, or just have these aspects of negativity?
Yeah, that's a really good point. One thing I like to talk to my girlfriend about this all the time, but it's like at the end of the day, we're talking about a diet here. This isn't a religion. This isn't an anti-war rally. There's so many virulent feelings, and people get so just emotional about these things. It's crazy how much a diet could become part of someone's identity. I see, not to knock anybody that does this, but I see a lot of people on Instagram and on different platforms that will literally put keto before their name, or carnivore before their name. So instead of Jeff, it would be like Keto Jeff or Carnivore Jeff. And I'm like, look, this that's not your identity. That's not who you are. This is literally one tiny part of your life. So keep some perspective about it. And I think that perhaps having a more open-minded mentality around these things would definitely help out, because people tend to get driven away by the whole, sort of like the soapbox, very preachy, yelling at you. If you're vegan, you're completely wrong. If you're doing a Mediterranean diet, no, that's not it. Like, this is the only diet, and this is the best diet. So I think that it's definitely good to keep some perspective about that and realize, hey, if other people are doing something and they're healthy and they seem to feel fine, who are we to judge? So that's kind of how I feel about it. But on the other side of the coin there, what I like to do in terms of promoting this stuff is I think that ultimately we are selling and marketing ourselves. We are the best proof of what we're doing here. So if you're trying to promote the carnivore diet, and if you really want this low carb movement and high protein movement to really take off, and you want this to gain some mainstream popularity, be the ultimate marketing piece for it. Look the part. Like, if you have great health and you have great energy, and your athletic performance is great, and you just seem to be a picture of health, naturally people are, it's sort of a logical fallacy to assume that, someone's diet is healthy just because they look healthy, but people are going to naturally gravitate towards that. They look at you and they look at your results and they think, okay, that's kind of something that I would be interested in doing. If everybody that did carnivore looked sickly and unhealthy and had no muscle mass and had no energy, but, scientifically it's the best diet, nobody would care to do it. So it's very, very important to just sort of walk the walk, and like practice what you preach. And that's kind of the way I like to approach it. I try to take care of myself first and make sure, am I healthy? Am I in shape? Do I have energy? And then I can honestly promote this stuff instead of, lying about it. There are a lot of people in this whole, the whole flexible dieting world, if it fits your macros, stuff like that. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about with like fitness YouTubers, where they honestly are subsisting on energy drinks and tons of coffee every day. And it's such an unhealthy lifestyle. They are literally driven by stimulants, and they are counting their calories and developing food disorders, and they look fantastic on Instagram, and they've all got their 8-packs and 5-6% body fat. Everybody's ripped up and shredded, and they'll do their summer cuts and things like that. But deep down, if you get their blood work, if you look at these people's healths, it's pretty bad. And it's only a matter of time before some of the underlying issues begin to present themselves, whether they're using juice or if they're not. And the other thing to look at is that a lot of these people doing these unhealthy diets are very young. So you can get away with a lot of things when you're young, but that's not necessarily a sustainable approach. So I would just say keep all those things in mind. Don't get too preachy with this kind of stuff, but ultimately just live it, and I think people will see, hey, that looks great. That person's leading by example. I want to know what they're on. I want to know what they're doing. That seems to be a fantastic diet. And I think that's how you're ultimately going to promote it, and it's going to gain a lot more mainstream acceptance and popularity.
I love it. That's a great way to end this interview. Be the change you want to see and set the example. Lead by example. William, where can people find you? What resources or links would be great for them to connect with you?
Definitely. So people can find me. Usually I'm posting most of my content on Instagram. So you can go to @WilliamSchufelt. That is William, SHEWFELT on Instagram. And that's where, I post a lot of content, a lot of different stories about the sort of things that I do training wise, diet wise. I've been a little bit inactive on YouTube recently, but with the content that I have coming out soon, I'm going to be a lot more active on YouTube. And I also might be doing some expert interviews with a lot of the guys that I look up to, guys and girls that I look up to, and that I look to for information. So my YouTube is youtube.com/Will Schufelt. So that's just Will, and then Schufelt. So that's my YouTube. And then if anybody is interested in my approach to training, diet, and what exactly I do to get sort of a very, very lean, chiseled, kind of warrior-like physique. It's not a bulky, massive bodybuilder, puffed up physique, but it's just a very healthy, lean, sort of athletic physique. I cover a lot of my mindset around that and how I structure my training and my nutrition in the Carnivore Shredding Program. So you can get that at thecarnivoreshreddingprogram.com. And I also offer consultations on there too. If people want to discuss and they want to sort of fine tune their diet, if they have any nagging questions, and I can help people out with that. I recently got tested at about 4% body fat. So I'm walking around like this year round. And I definitely feel great. So I think that that's something to be considered. A lot of people peak for these things and then they feel terrible or they'll put a bunch of fat on. So I think that's sort of a little feather in the cap of the carnivore movement there.
That's awesome. Go check him out, folks. Go find William. I'll have links to all of this in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on, William. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Scott. Best of luck on the podcast. I can't wait to hear future episodes and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered? Or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore or research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.